Well, hello. My name is Dr. Vita Jones, and I'm looking forward to spending some time with you talking about one of my favorite subjects. I want to talk to you today about literacy for early childhood special education students. We often say the phrase, all students can learn, but we have to take into account what it's going to take to make that happen. When children have special needs and are identified as having an IEP or an IFSP, they are found eligible under one of 13 different eligibility categories. This presents a challenge to teachers. You may have a student that has a hearing impairment, a visual impairment, student with Down syndrome, autism, student with a communication disorder, health impaired, and a varied amount of other disabilities. When this is the case, we still are responsible for providing that student with a method of communication. Sometimes it will be to be able to speak, and other times it will be other things that we have to provide for the child to be able to communicate. We also know that when students have the ability to communicate, it lessens the frustration that they have about being in the classroom and often opens up their learning experience because they feel included. They have a sense of autonomy. They're able to express what they need and express frustration and just a general well-being in your classroom. So we want to look at the importance of providing literacy strategies for students with special needs. And in this case, we're looking at the very young student that has a need to communicate. As you can see, this slide is for a course that I'm teaching entitled Special Education 436, Literacy for Early Childhood Special Education Specialists. Once again, the phrase we often use is all children can learn to read and write. And we know that there's a theoretical rationale for that. We want to explore that tonight. Emergent literacy means exactly what it says. The ability to acquire literacy is emerging. Students have not mastered it yet, particularly very young students. The term literacy speaks to the intersection of information, print concepts, functions, writing, letter sounds, word knowledge, and language comprehension. Some key literacy terms are used. We talk about phonemes. We also talk about acquisition, language acquisition. And we talk about communication for children with disabilities, maybe using a picture exchange system, sign language, and there are ways to gesture and provide information for students so that they can acquire some communication skills. Shared reading is one of the most successful ways to build a love for literacy in students. The adult who's the expert in reading takes time to sit with a child and read with the book, facing the child so they can see the pictures and they can pick up what we call contextual clues from pictures. We know that young children have books with lots of pictures. So this modality of learning is very powerful because the student has the voice of the teacher as a context. They also have the pictures in the book. It's a shared experience. Anything that you do with children, once they see that you value the experience, they come to value it too. So shared reading can never be replaced. It is something that we have to do with all children that we are trying to teach communication and literacy to. Shared writing is the same way. Oftentimes, when young children imitate you, they'll do what they see you do. And we might say, oh, imitation is flattery, but imitation is actually a precursor to the skill that they're imitating. If they're imitating reading, we know they may even have the book upside down, but they're in the position and the posture of reading. Same with share of reading. They may have a pencil, and what we call scribbling is actually developmentally appropriate in that they are making their circles, they are making lines, which are precursor skills to writing the alphabet. Also, it's important that students engage with the actual alphabet in letter recognition and sound recognition in lowercase and uppercase. And one of the ways to introduce this to very young children is with their name. Children see their name repeatedly and so begin to learn the letters in their name quicker than they do other letters. But we know once they learn the letters in their name, that generalizes to learning other letters in the alphabet. There are formalized ways of learning the alphabet, and several researchers have studied, and they began to group certain alphabets together that look alike or written alike so that the student can learn a multiple amount of letters at one time instead of going sequentially through the alphabet. But there are different ways of teaching the alphabet, and a savvy teacher will explore several of them. And they may take pieces from each of them and introduce those to their students. Phonological awareness is very important. Reducing words to their lowest common denominator, so to speak, or the sounds that make up a word, and knowing those letter sounds for communication are extremely important. Knowing about phonemes, there are 44 phonemes, and just learning how to pronounce them, seeing where they are in the word is beneficial. It may be a higher order skill for those young students in special ed, but it certainly is the goal that we're headed toward and can be written as such in the IEP. And then our objectives can be some of the smaller pieces that we teach. Independent reading, wow, that's the goal. We want to ignite a fire in students, so to speak, to be involved in independent reading. Independent reading can take you places you've never gone to. It's a sustained experience that once children adapt to it, really enjoy it. And so we can do that in increments as we expose children to literacy. Independent writing opens the world, even digital writing at this time. And so we want to make sure that we're setting our children up for success. We're thinking about those students with special needs that may have difficulty with their motor skills and not be able to hold a writing utensil, but we do know that there are adaptations that we can make. There's also assistive technology, augmented technology that we can provide to give the students an opportunity to engage in both independent reading and independent writing. And finally, I've listed here exploring books. When you have a literacy-rich environment, students are more apt to engage with books. And there are so many ways that we can engage students with books. One of the favorites of the children is for them to write the book, and you take dictation. And after you've written the story, to maybe condense it to a smaller paper and put it together as an actual book with a spiral binding and place it in your library. And then sit back and watch how many times the student will go and look at the words in that book that they dictated. For students that are nonverbal or for students that are second language learners, putting together authentic pictures and making a book is equally as effective. There may be pictures that the parents can send in that you can copy and turn into books, and the child can see themselves represented in those books and go over and repeatedly look at them, and it will give them a sense of connection, as well as a love for literacy if they can explore books that are meaningful to them. One of the other websites that's very effective for teachers to use is the Tar Reader website. In tarreader.org, teachers can go in and create books and talk about them in a personalized way. They can create a book that's about the child, about the classroom, about an experience that the child had, about a lesson plan, and then it can be chronicled in the Tar Heel Reader website. And other teachers can come behind and look at it, and you can add yours as well. And this is a good way to introduce the family, give the family this website to create their own books at home and engage in literacy that way. So we know that even in utero, children are wired for sound. It's good to read to your baby before they even enter the world, just to let them know that you are welcoming them and you're preparing them for literacy. Through the research, we found out that the two most important things to an infant are the human face and the human voice. And when we cradle a baby in our elbow, that gives them about 13 inches away from our face. And we can engage with them with gazing. And that is a form of communication as well. Communication can be verbal or nonverbal. The gesturing of gazing at a baby and getting their attention helps set them up to learn to read later because they're beginning to track your voice, track your face. And so the things we do with infants are very important. The first year of life, children are learning at a rapid pace, not to be exceeded by any other time in life. They are really, quote, on fire. Their brains are processing so much information. And so we want to make sure we take this time to capture all of the wonderful things that they can learn about literacy. So singing to your baby while you're feeding the baby, consistent conversation with infants is critical in helping them to become communicators as they grow older. There are many times when a parent will engage with a young baby and the baby will actually try to engage right back. These reciprocal interactions set the child up for literacy and should be engaged early and often. Children, because they're growing at such a rapid rate, require stimulation from the adult, but not overstimulation. It's important to introduce them to concepts around communication and literacy, singing, talking, and engaging with them. But once they show displeasure or they begin to fidget, then it's time to withdraw and come back at a later time so as not to frustrate the child. Some of the things that we as caregivers do with children are purely instinctive, such as singing to them. But compared to a classroom where you're doing instruction, remember that when you're feeding your infant, that's a time to build the skill for communication by singing and talking, explaining what you're doing. I'm giving you a bottle today, and I hope this is your favorite. And I've heated it up just for you, and you're going to really enjoy it. And then also during those bio times when you have to clean the babies up, excellent classroom time for you to even describe what you're doing. You know, I've got to get you out of this. This is a little smelly, so I'm going to clean you up and you're going to be fresh as a daisy. And then we're going to go and talk to the dog or call grandma. So a consistent amount of conversation is so important with children, especially children that have special needs that may have been hospitalized for a while longer and did not meet the development criteria when they were younger. So early childhood classrooms need to be nurturing. You need to foster a lot of collaboration with the parents so that they will be able to come into the classroom and note the practices you have with their child and be able to duplicate them at home. It really is a team effort. It takes a village to build literacy in young children. But we start with those basics. We start with the theoretical principles, like the constructivist theory that children make meaning by doing. So when they are providing, whether it's cooing or oohing, we need to get right in there and extend that. When they coo, you might add to it. And when they're cooing, getting ready for those hard sounds, their consonants, and their oohing leads them to developing their vowel sounds. So when we see that and we encourage it and we engage in it, one of the researchers, Machado, said that early childhood teachers need to be very intentional. And so when children come into your room, it's often good to have several lists of their names in the classroom, maybe on a clipboard. And this anecdotal method of collecting data is very helpful because you want to make sure that you're documenting that you're spending quality time with each child every week. And if you're intentional about it, make a chart and check it off. So Monday may be one child, and you sit with that child and read part of a story. Tuesday, you may eat a snack with another child. And when you're doing these activities, it's very important that you're eye level with the child and not hovering over them, but that you sit next to them or get on your knees. You're able to look into their eyes and engage with them. There's no better feeling than to know you're heard. And when they're talking and they say things to you, and you have a responsive wait time, you don't rush, and you don't look like you're bothered, and you lean in, it really reinforces the ability for them to speak. And with our children that may have a speech impediment, that are having difficulty, even more patience is required. Oftentimes, a brief amount of sign language will help that child be able to unlock the thought processes that they have and be able to communicate in your classroom. So you want to be intentional. You want to be a good listener. You want to learn how to incorporate wait time and not rush a child. Often children, and we as adults have to get used to it, they repeat things. They say them over and over and over again. And the same happens when you read a story to them that they like. They oftentimes will choose that same story each day as if they've never heard it before. And that's because their brain craves order and they're looking for that sameness that they can depend on, that order that's provided with language and with reading. It makes sense to them to hear it over and over. And it's actually comforting to them to hear those things repeatedly. And they're listening, not just as though it's their first time, but they're listening in a way where they're learning the words. They're looking at the pictures. They're making meaning of what you're saying. And that magical moment where they hear the words leave your mouth and it's depicted on a page through a picture or a symbol. That is when the light bulb comes on and students begin to read. They know that each word holds within it a significant meaning for something outside of just those letters. So we do, once again, need to be very intentional in providing language to children. And it takes, time for us to get to know the child. Often, if they will only spend a few seconds with us, it's okay. You just want to extend it at times to the level that they will tolerate the interactions. That's the level you want to teach to. When children are sitting in maybe circle time or center time and they hear a story and they get restless, well, they're not getting the most out of it. And it may be good to have a backup activity so that they can go away for a little while and get rid of some of the nervous energy or play for a while and come back and return to a story. It isn't mandatory in early childhood that children sit for the entire duration of a story. It may be good that the teacher only read part of the story, but leave on a suspenseful note where they will be excited about you coming back to that story. One of the stories I was fond of and loved to read to children was from a book called No David. Oh, the anticipation of trying to see Mother's face, which we never saw, but we certainly knew what her communication was by her gestures. David had knocked over a vase in his mother's living room. And shortly after that, Mother found him and, with both arms crossed, gave him a bit of a scolding. And so our children, hearing that story in their minds, can conjure up, oh boy, that seems so familiar. This is what they're telling themselves. I've done that before. And I've had to deal with the consequences of my mom being not so happy with me. So all of these moments really come into play when we're working with students with disabilities and we're trying to provide support and we're letting them know that this is an enjoyable, engaging activity. Reading is for everyone, even those that are nonverbal. They can hear the stories. We can put a story on book, on tape, put headphones on, let the student hear the story. Students that don't hear can have sign language, and a story can be acted out for them so that they can get meaning and draw meaning from words as well. Okay. Establishing an environment for successful literacy learning. It's not always easy to learn to read and write. And oftentimes I pause when I'm teaching this course and I ask you, how did you learn to read and write? And since this is a webinar and I don't have a live audience, I'll share how I learned to read and write. Imitation. I would see my father reading the newspaper or my mother reading a book, and I would sit down and pretend as though I was reading. And I would make up a story because obviously I didn't know the words. And my poor dolls, line them up, they'd have to listen to the story. And through that imitation, I began to fall in love with books. And so when I got to class and I learned the alphabet, of course, the first word I learned was my name, and learning my name was very important. And then trying to write my name, that sense of autonomy that I can identify who I am in the midst of all these other people. I have a unique name, and I look across the table and someone has another name that's totally different than my name. Boy, this communication thing is pretty cool. My favorite book growing up was a book called Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. I think I was fifth or sixth grade. When I would come in from lunch, we would be hot and sweaty, we'd eaten, and we'd be a little tired. And our teacher would wait until after lunch to have a literacy class. But before the class began, she would take maybe 10 minutes to read these cliffhangers called Mrs. Pickle Wiggle. And in these stories, the children were always misbehaving and they needed a cure to act better. Say, for instance, there was a boy that refused to take a bath. And so Mrs. Piggle Wiggle would plant seeds all over his body so that plants would grow. In another book, there was a story about a student who always answered back talking to their parent. So Mrs. Piggle Wiggle bought a parrot that did the same thing to the child to let them know how irritating it was. So those stories have stayed with me so much so until all the children in my family pretty much have a copy of those books. Now, for our children that are having difficulty and they're not able to read, as I said earlier, it is no excuse for not reading to them, whether or not they have hearing issues or not. If the student is hearing impaired, read the story and put their hand on your throat so that they can hear, so they can feel, since they can't hear. They can feel the vibrations of communication. and that will encourage them to use their voice as well. Okay, now some of the stats on our students with disabilities, they're 2.5% likely to read below basic levels of achievement. No surprise there. By fourth grade, unlikely to make basic inferences like difficulty comprehending or identify main ideas for the problem in a work or a fiction, or gather new knowledge from non-fiction tests. So we see that when the collaboration around communication isn't very strong in the early years, by fourth grade, which is a pivotal year, they still are struggling. So it's good for us to provide as many resources as we can, the younger the student is. If it's likely that they will be nonverbal, then immediately we need to provide a picture exchange system for a student so that they are able to communicate and to get a lot of experience communicating with the teacher and even with other students. So by fourth grade, there's a level of confidence they have when they're using these exchange systems. And that can be built over a period of time. And so when they go into, if they go into a gen ed setting because of inclusion, they will still feel confident that they are able to communicate their needs and their displeasures, things that they absolutely do not like. They can use their words to describe those. Okay. Students, 1 in 10 students with severe communication issues and physical disabilities read at the same levels as age peers without disabilities. So only 1 in 10 are on par with their typically developing peers. But that's okay. Emergent literacy can occur at any time. It doesn't just occur with the very young students. It occurs when it occurs. Whether they are a young child, whether they're an older child, it's still emergent literacy. If they haven't acquired it, then it's emerging. And we need to facilitate the strategies to help that take place. About 14% of young children can read short passages with understanding. These are our students with disabilities. Only 80% can read only basic sight words or are emergent in their understanding. So we usually don't get 100%, but if we get 80% of students with disabilities that can identify basic sight words and they're emerging in their understanding, we are on the right track. And it often, as I said earlier, it may not correlate with their age, but whenever they start, and I want to pause and say something about that, because if it's an older child acquiring literacy for the first time, or it's continuing, then we have to find age-appropriate materials. You wouldn't, because a child is on a first or second grade level, and now they're, in junior high, you wouldn't take the same reading materials that you would use for a younger child to teach those skills to an older child. You have to find age-appropriate, developmentally appropriate, and age-appropriate materials. So whatever the rest of the junior high students are looking at, you have to either create that reading material or purchase it that is right on the same level as the child without the disabilities. This is one of the principles of IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act says that they have to be exposed to the general ed curriculum. And that means that whatever the general ed students are doing, they need to be exposed to that, whether they can do it or not. A goal from the general ed curriculum needs to be incorporated into their IEP. And then the special education teacher comes in and creates modifications and adaptations, small steps to reach that goal. This is how the system is supposed to work. Does it always work like this? Well, not always, but there is an ideal. IDEA is the lesson plan for special educators. The IEP and the IFSP really is the marching orders for teachers. We are giving that child an individualized educational plan. That means it doesn't have to be like anyone else's. Of course, we want to incorporate the gen ed standards so that they aren't left out. Because if they're of the age of a typical developing child, whatever that typical developing child is exposed to in the general ed classroom, we want to keep that right on par with the child with a disability so that they aren't looking at materials that are for kindergartners or pre-K students when they're in the 7th grade, so that they are having the same experiences as their typical peers. Whether they can communicate adequately or not, they still need to be exposed to those things. It wouldn't be, and here's an example, it just wouldn't be appropriate, even in a social setting, if you had a child that had a disability in junior high and maybe they ate lunch with everyone else in the lunchroom, to come in there with a Dora lunchbox and sit down and eat lunch. Well, no, but there are things that you can do that are age appropriate. If they like some of those things, they can be used intermittently, but not for social emotional purposes. Also, they shouldn't be reading books that are primarily cartoon animated, characters. But there's a way, especially with technology, with the iPads and with the apps, that they can be exposed to language, to literacy, to the alphabet in a way that is equal to what their typical peers are doing. Text messages, if they can learn to do text messages, if they have the dexterity in their hands and they can manipulate things, have fine motor skills, then they can create text messages, which is appropriate for their age. Okay, so we want to be aware of how the student would feel learning the skill. If they're learning it as though they are emergent readers that are very young, then that's inappropriate to use those same materials. But it's through a lot of careful observations. I think one of the greatest things a teacher can do before they jump in and just start working with a student is to sit back and jot down the things that children like and observe them. So those things are the things that you can use for rewards. I remember a young student in my classroom who only liked the color yellow. So his mother would dress him in yellow. He'd come to school, want to sit in the yellow chair. He used the yellow crayon. He had a yellow backpack. And so initially when he came in at 3 years old, it's appropriate. There's no problem. We're going to let him enjoy the color yellow. But around April, and thinking about a gen ed setting for the next year or the following year, we have to start weaning him out of some of that and introducing him to new things in a way. So you find out what he really likes, like maybe there's a dinosaur and the dinosaur is blue. Well, we already know he likes dinosaurs. So we introduce the blue using something he already likes. So we're always looking for ways to expand the knowledge of a child and not let them stay in one rigid form. We want them to be able to transition into other areas seamlessly. And so we have to be really savvy about how we introduce new things. In these slides, there are some phenomenal stories of individuals that had disabilities that they've overcome. Now, I realize this slide is about an early childhood special ed literacy program, but they don't stay in early childhood. They grow up. And it's so nice to be able to see some of the results of families and children when they grow up, what they're able to do. This is a story of Haben Girma, the first deafblind person to graduate from Harvard Law School. Haben Girma is a human rights lawyer advancing disability justice. Wouldn't you know it? Having come through what she's come through, being deaf and blind, that she would want to advance justice for individuals with disabilities. President Obama named her a White House Champion of Change. What a name. She received the Helen Keller Achievement Award, a spot in the Forbes 30 and Under 30 list, and Time 100 Talks. Another president, Bill Clinton, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Chancellor Angela Merkel, have all honored Haben. Haben believes disability is an opportunity. So she's renaming it. Resilience is a characteristic that individuals with disabilities must have. The ability to take what others see as your disability and turn it into an opportunity for innovation is quite creative. And now she teaches organizations the importance of choosing inclusion. I often think when we're talking about inclusion in our classrooms and how we need to merge general ed and special education together, it would be more organic if they often tried working together or were required to work together in college. And if there was cross-training, if special educators took methods classes and learned how to teach the way general ed teachers teach. And then conversely, if general education teachers took special education classes and begin to understand how to create accommodations and modifications and provide support for students. And in a utopic, wonderful world, that would be the way to approach this and create inclusive settings. So Ms. Girma is a strong proponent of inclusion, and she's been featured in the New York Times, Oprah's Magazine, and in the Today Show. Haben was born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area, where she currently lives, and her memoir takes readers on an adventure around the world, including her parents' home in Eritrea and Ethiopia, building a school under the scorching Saharan sun, training with a guide dog in New Jersey. Look at some of the adventures she's had, climbing an iceberg in Alaska, fighting for the blind readers in the courthouse in Vermont, and talking with President Obama at the White House. Her book is warm, funny, and thoughtful, and very uplifting. And it's a testament to her determination. So I wanted to highlight an individual that had experienced this type of interaction, just learning how important it is to engage with others and put your best foot forward, as they say, and make sure that you're out there being a proponent for change. Now, this takes a lot of confidence because people shy away and they feel like, oh my goodness, I just don't know if I can really, share my life with people. Oftentimes, with people with disabilities, there is a shame-based part of their lives that they have to experience, they have to go through. One of the things that we can do to offset that is the way we refer to people. We are incorporating what we call person-first language. So we say the individual with a disability, okay? We say their name first, Robin with autism, the student with Down syndrome, instead of something like the little Down syndrome kid. All of that language lessens the value of the person we're talking about, which we don't want to do. We want to add dignity. One of the things I do in my classroom is to take like a $20 bill and just crumble it up. And first I have it nice and, clean, straight and flat. And I show it and I say, wow, look at this, what's the value of a $20 bill? And they're like, oh, I can do this with it, or I can do that with it. And so as a parent, that you can do a lot with it. It's clean, it's fresh, it's nice, it's no trouble in communicating what it's for. It's easily transferable. Take that same $20 bill, crush it up in your hand, maybe put it on the floor, pick it back up. Does it lose any value? Can you smooth it out? Can you continue to use it? You certainly can. Ask me how I know. I've crumbled up money and put it in the bottom of my purse, put it in my coat pocket, forgot about it, went back later and found it and was just elated that here was money that I did not know I had. And it's kept its value. I can go right then and spend it for whatever I want to use it for. So we have to remember that just because the body may not work or function the way we believe it was designed to function, that person's value is not diminished. And the greatest gift we can give them as teachers is a voice, the ability to make decisions and have autonomy is the greatest gift. Every living thing communicates in one way or another. I often, and this is not any negative thoughts toward people with disabilities, but just people in general, those of us that have animals, they don't speak our language. They don't know what we're saying, but they do know what we're saying because they can tell by our gestures, by our tone, by our look. All of these things come into play, especially if they've done something that they shouldn't do. And they usually retreat, they react to it, and we love that interaction we have with our pets. It's comforting. We feel like they're part of our families. So think about how much more is important that we provide students with disabilities a method of communicating. Another story that I remember a teacher sharing some years ago in teaching a student, maybe 7th or 8th grade, who had cerebral palsy. He had been in school all through kindergarten and had never been given a device to speak or a method of speaking. No sign language, no picture exchange system, because of the motor skills deficits that he had. People where he was at just assumed that cognitively he could not relate to them. So he was not encouraged to communicate. So his teacher this year, that was her thing. I'm going to make sure all my students can communicate. And so she provided a device for him. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I'll never forget the story she told. The first thing that he said when he was able to communicate, and this was a young teacher and not much older than the students herself, is he said, "You are hot." So that's typical of what I think a 7th grade boy, that may be what a typical 7th grade boy might say. And so now that he had a method of communication, he was doing what was developmentally appropriate. And he was, I don't think flirting, but he was making an observation about his teacher. And so, where we can argue about how appropriate it was for him to say that, bottom line was he was doing what his typical peers were doing. And for the first time in his life, he was able to discuss something that was very important to him. Now, I'm sure he got out of that vein and began to do other things and make requests. And that reminds me of another story of a video that I often share with students of an older gentleman who had been in an institution. And it's really interesting when we talk about institutions in this country. The East Coast was full of institutions for people with disabilities. And he was in one of those, and they lost funding. And he had to go to a halfway house. And he had never been given any method of communicating either. Well, in the halfway house, there were people from the field of special education, I'm proud to say, that went in and assessed the needs of the people that lived there and got him a device to speak. When he was able to talk, they could not shut him up. Whatever device they used, he lit up. But one of the sad things about it is he told horror stories about the institution that he was living in and how glad he was when the funding was cut and he was finally released. Had they still had the institution, his testimony alone could have gotten it closed down. But can you imagine being locked in a body for years with perfectly fine cognitive ability, but the motor skills to speak because of a disability weren't there? And this is what happened to this gentleman. And so when we provide an opportunity to build literacy in young students, we open the world for them. These students can be more marginalized because of their lack of communication. They can be more victimized because of their lack of communication. So it is imperative that we provide strategies for them to communicate in just issues of safety, in issues of preference. Why would you want to eat food you don't like, people putting them in front of you, and you might just show your displeasure, but you're not able to tell them what you do like? So we want to provide what are common sense things to students to make sure that they have the ability to speak. Or if they're not able to speak, we still want them to have the ability to communicate. Building wings. Don Johnson wrote Building Wings to help students build self-confidence. Through personal stories, students can identify with Don's struggles as a learner. Often the first thing that students want to do when they overcome a barrier is to reach back and help another student overcome some of those same barriers. And so he uses valuable lessons learned from his 8th grade teacher to show how students can advocate for themselves and learn in different ways. He also wrote Building Wings as a reminder for teachers and parents and other faculty that individual learning needs and behavioral science can be disguised. So here's the book that he wrote about his situation and how it was important that he get a chance to be able to engage with other people. Let's look at a little bit more of his story right here. Well, it appears that we won't be able to look at that unless we subscribe. So let's go back. But here's information about Don Johnson that I think will be useful and that will be helpful in helping you understand just how important it is for students with disabilities to have the experiences of others so that can motivate them, so they can see how other people have overcome their struggles. There are so many people today with disabilities until the shame has gone away to some degree. It used to be a time in our country where everybody with disabilities dealt with a shame-based reality. Like I said earlier, a lot of them were placed in institutions. And outside of the institutions, a lot of times these students were not able to go to school. They just were left at home with babysitters or someone in their family. And sometimes it wasn't really good situations for them. But there was a civil rights movement for people with disabilities in the 60s and 70s. There was a civil rights movement for African American students so that they could enter schools with white students, Brown versus Board of Topeka, Kansas. Well, there was also, shortly after that, another civil rights movement, and it started on the West Coast in a university where some students that were quadriplegic wanted to take some courses at the university, which sounded like a great idea. So they entered the university to register for their classes, one in particular student. And the class that he wanted to take was on the 3rd floor. And the school didn't have an elevator. They didn't have any way of getting him to the 3rd floor. So they just simply told him, you need to take classes on the 1st floor. And his mother was an attorney. So when she got the news that he would be limited in what he wanted to take, she filed a lawsuit against the university and she won. And they had to put in an elevator. And so we know we have the Americans Disability Act. But one thing in particular really began to change our country and give us more of a tolerance and an acceptance and providing support for people with disabilities. And that was when our husbands, our brothers, our fathers, our uncles, and our sons went off to fight in wars, able bodied, and came back with PTSD, Agent Orange plagued with that, missing limbs. All of these things fell under the category of disabilities. And were we going to exclude them? Were we going to put them in an institution because they had a disability? No. So our country began to look at people with disabilities through a different lens. Also, politically, we had a president who had a family member with a significant disability. So much so until they created the Special Olympics, and that was the Kennedys. And so our foundation as a country began to change because people with disabilities were more visible through the political system, and our men were returning home from wars with disabilities. So we knew then that we could not take this negative approach to dealing with them, but we needed to provide support for individuals with disabilities. So it takes that sometimes to bring change, and that's what happened. And fortunately, we're still making changes. Right now, there are a lot of actors and actresses that have children with disabilities, and they have come out strong. They have come out loud. They have come out, stating that they want support. They don't want their children hidden away as if something was wrong with them, but they want them to be, included. And so these are the ways that they feel like they can include them by bringing all of these things to the forefront. Okay, so teachers, you matter. You matter in building literacy in children. You are, quote, the professional. Oftentimes parents are looking to you because you should have in your toolbox strategies that will support their children. They are dealing with their unique individual child. You, on the other hand, have dealt with many children. So teachers have to have a knowledge of others, and you can glean that knowledge. First, you need the theoretical foundations and frameworks. Of course, you need that. And then you have to become a student of the child. Yes, you're the teacher of the child, but you put yourself in the role of a student of a child. What would you want to know if you were that child? Because the child's never been an adult, but you have been a child. What kind of things do they want to know? What are they curious about? How can they communicate? And when we're dealing with the very young children, it's also good to assess where the parent is. What does the parent want for their child? And how can you help that to occur? There are many ways you can do this. When you have an informal meeting with the parent, jot down some of the things that they express to you. I remember a parent telling me, I'm just having so much difficulty getting my child to go to bed at night. And I'm thinking, I work from maybe 8 to 3, and then I don't deal with bedtime issues. But you know what? Going to bed from doing whatever activity they're doing is also called a transition. And I teach transition all day long, from the bus to my classroom, from my classroom to the learning center, from the learning center to circle time, from circle time to lunchtime, from lunchtime to computer time, throughout the entire day. I'm teaching transitions. So why can't I share what I do to transition their child from one point to the other with the parent so they can duplicate it at home for the transition of bedtime? So make sure you share those things with families. Okay, means of communication. The first means of communication is to have with the parent and get their thought on their child communicating. Would you like to incorporate sign language? Would you like to take sign language? Would you support if I were to take sign language and use it with your child? What about the picture exchange system? You should have a conversation with the speech therapist and the parent to target communication often and early. The earlier, the better, because the less ability that they have to communicate, the more chances that they are going to have support for their behavior. Okay, repetition with variety. And that kind of reminds me of universal design learning. What can you incorporate that's in multiple ways of learning something, multiple ways of representing something, multiple teaching strategies? If you don't get it one way, come back another way and teach it. If they're nonverbal, can they point? Can they match? Okay, what can you do to broaden your methods and your ways of teaching? Teachers matter because cognitive engagement is what we're looking for in students. How will you assess that? Be intentional about the assessment of that. How will you determine where a child is cognitively, especially if they're having difficulty communicating? Okay, so when you provide them with a choice and they're able to make a choice, whether it's, an eye gaze or a smile or whatever way that they communicate with you, become a student of that child, as I said earlier, to find out. Because if babies can communicate with us, they don't have language. If our beloved pets can communicate with us, and we know they won't ever have language, that child with a disability is trying to communicate with you. And it may be through their behavior. So then it would be interesting to find out what is the antecedent, if it's a negative behavior or if it's a good behavior. What is happening just before the behavior? If it's something that's occurring that's good, well, then you want to increase that. But if it's something that's negative, you want to address that. It's not about extinction all the time, but address it. See what they need and put yourself in their shoes. Try to figure out what they need. Okay, so cognitive clarity goes along with engagement, and then a personal connection to the curriculum. Any materials you use in your classroom should be representative of the demographic you're teaching. If you have children in there that are in wheelchairs, that have disabilities, that are second language learners, all of those diverse, differentiated ways of teaching should be incorporated into your practices. You're looking to reach them on multiple modalities. One of the more modern theorists, Howard Gardner, talks about multiple ways of learning, how children may, through spatial or kinesthetic movement, they learn that way. So taking them outside, think of a child with ADHD, letting them bounce a ball and say the syllable of a word. That may be a way to address the needs of that child, but make a personal connection to the curriculum. One of the things I really love about building literacy in young children is the use of music and song. What's so wonderful about it? It sets at ease the child's mind about knowing all the words. Just hear the music. Second language learners, everybody's moving, they're engaging their bodies, and that's sending signals to their brain. They're firing their brain to learn. They don't have to worry necessarily about the words. They can just move and feel comfortable in their bodies. And when they see other children around them doing the same thing, they have a bond, they have a kinship, they have a sense of belonging. You're establishing a culture in your classroom. All these things are foundational to students learning and thriving in school. And then the encouragement of risk taking. Maybe you can see they have an idea, or they have a word, or they have a thought. Well, then stop and develop it. Don't run past that. Help them develop that word. What were you thinking? Tell me. There's no right or wrong. Give it a try. Okay. Encourage multiple risk taking in building literacy, saying the word wrong, saying one letter out of the word, just whatever they give you. And in special ed, I want to pause and say this. The difference between special ed, one of the differences, and general ed. In general ed, you get graded on your merit and what you've done and all of that, the criteria that you have before and how well you've exceeded it. Well, in special ed, we reward effort. We reward effort toward literacy in special education. So when they take that risk and they try, oh my goodness, the social emotional concept of trying, when you have your peers looking at you, wondering if you make this wrong sound, will you be ridiculed? When the expectation of the teacher is high and you don't want to disappoint them, you have to create an environment where risk taking is the norm every day. You take risks in front of them and try it and see and talk about how you learn from it. Comprehensive instruction. And I think what I'd like to say about that, when building literacy and emergent readers, there may be a tendency to use a lot of technology, for instance. You have to be careful because there's a lot of things on the market that promise to do things that they really don't do. So it's good to experiment with technology. I would have an IT or an AT person included in my discourse, in my IEP meetings, or just meeting with them one-on-one. But you never are going to get away from direct instruction. That's the foundation of teaching, okay? Is you have to teach one-on-one or with a group. And then you use all these other devices because they're not research-based yet, a lot of the technology, but it's a supplemental resource that you can use. And if you have to use it to teach direct instruction, of course, that's fine. But make direct instruction your comprehensive instruction the first goal. And then significant time allocation. And I talked earlier about wait time, but also time for them to process information and repeat it a little bit later, come back to it. We use the term generalization in special education. So we may feel like a student knows something, but until they know it in different environments over periods of time, do they really know it? We want them to be able to generalize the information they know to other settings. Okay. Review and summarize the Bill of Rights for students. Did you know there was such a thing as a Bill of Rights? And so quickly, without reading all of it, the Bill of Rights says that every child, it starts where we started. Every child can learn. And it's up to us to find the procedures, the strategies, and the practices that support that learning. And because it's an individualized plan, then it doesn't have to look like anybody else's. I remember in a speech class, the speech therapist came in, he was teaching a young child to say the hard word, the hard letter G, 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 G. And the child was having trouble. And the speech teacher was a man, laid down on the floor, put some water in his mouth, and gargled. Grrr, grrr. And the child was looking at him with his hand on his throat and was able to feel the vibration of the sound, the hard G sound, and eventually came to be able to say it. So that's kind of like UDL, multiple means of representation. But the Bill of Rights speaks to an obligation that teachers have to supply students with methods of communicating. And we know that builds emergent literacy that we can build on, whether they're early childhood and they're just now getting communication and literacy, or whether they're older and they have not been exposed to it. That's still emerging as well. So I hope this was helpful for you. I hope you can take these things into your classroom and start addressing the needs of children without communication. Most of all, I hope you will have a dogged optimism to go in and begin to unlock the potential that your students have. So thank you for joining me in this time together.